a man's hands closed around a woman's face in the middle of a churchyard. He pulled her toward him before she could speak. Her bouquet hit the dirt. 20 people stopped breathing at once. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. The man was big. His beard reached his chest. His coat was patched at the elbows and smelled of pine smoke. His eyes had not blinked since the woman stepped down from the wagon. He kissed her. Right there. Before the vows. Before the preacher. Before he had even said his own name. His name was Caleb Doyle. He had not seen another human being in 10 years. When he pulled back from that kiss, he looked at the crowd and said one sentence nobody in that valley would ever forget. What he said next should have ended the wedding right before it started. Stay with me on this one. The story of how Hannah Reeve came to be standing in that churchyard in the first place starts with a folded letter and a long ride west. She'd lost her husband to a fever the year before. 2 days of cough, then nothing. She was 26 years old, with no children, no money, and a brother-in-law who decided 3 weeks after the burial that the house wasn't really hers. The deed had been her husband's. The papers were ambiguous. The brother-in-law had a wife and 4 children of his own, and Hannah had nothing but her widowhood and her sewing machine. She did not fight him. She'd seen women fight men over land back east, and she'd seen how those fights ended. So she sold what she could. She kept her mother's silver hairbrush and her wedding ring. She put a notice in a publication that circulated all the way out to the territories. Widow 26, healthy, willing to travel. She did not say willing to marry. She said willing to travel. 3 letters came back over the next 2 months. 2 were from men whose handwriting alone told her enough. The third was from a man named Caleb Doyle. His letter was short. 6 sentences. He said he had a cabin and 40 acres of cleared ground and a sound roof. He said he had not been to a town in 7 years at the time of writing. He said the trapper who carried his furs had read him her notice out loud, and the trapper had agreed to write a letter on his behalf because Caleb had not held a pen in a long time. He said he had no debt and no children and no other woman waiting. He said he could not promise her happiness, but he could promise her honesty. He said if she came, he would meet her at the church in the valley below his mountain on the 3rd Sunday of June. That was the letter. Hannah read it sitting at her kitchen table, and she read it again, and she folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and did not take it out for a full day. Then she wrote back yes. The ride west was 31 days. 2 trains, a stagecoach, and the last 70 miles in the wagon of a freighter who didn't talk much and watched her like she was made of glass. She arrived in the valley on the 2nd Saturday of June. The 3rd Sunday was the next morning. She slept that night in the back room of a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Tully. Mrs. Tully poured her tea and looked at her for a long time before she said anything. Then she said, "You're the one marrying the Doyle man." Hannah said yes. Mrs. Tully did not say it like a question. She said it like a sentence in a court of law. Then she sat down across from Hannah and folded her hands and told her things. She told Hannah that Caleb Doyle had come down out of the high country once a year for 10 years to trade furs with the same trapper, and that nobody in the valley had ever heard him speak more than 3 words at a time. She told Hannah that his cabin was at the head of a draw 2 days' ride from the nearest road, and that the only way up there in winter was by snowshoe. She told Hannah that some folks thought Caleb Doyle was simple in the head, others thought he was running from something, and a few thought he was just a man who had decided early on that people were more trouble than they were worth. She told Hannah it wasn't too late to turn around. Hannah listened. She drank her tea. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning she put on the dress she had brought for the wedding, which was the same dress she had worn to her husband's funeral the year before, the only good dress she owned, dyed back from black to dove gray. She picked a handful of wildflowers from the side of the road on the walk to the church. She tied them with a piece of ribbon she'd cut off her petticoat. That was her bouquet. Caleb Doyle was already standing in the churchyard when she arrived. He had ridden down the night before and slept under a tree because he did not want to be late. He had not seen a woman in 10 years. And the moment Hannah Reeve stepped down from the wagon, he started walking toward her, and he did not stop, and he did not say a word, and what happened next was the thing that made the whole valley remember her name. He kissed her in the middle of the churchyard, before the preacher had even opened his book. 20 seconds of silence. 20 pairs of eyes. Hannah did not move. She did not push him away. She did not lean in either. She stood in his hands and let it happen, and when he stepped back, he looked at her the way a man looks at the first warm fire after a long winter. Then he turned to the crowd. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, he said. "I had to know if you were real." That was the sentence. It came out of him plain, the way you'd say the price of corn. There was no shame in it and no apology. It was just a true thing he had said because it was the first true thing in his head, and he did not know any other way to talk. The preacher cleared his throat twice before he found his voice. "Mrs." Tully covered her mouth with her hand. 2 men in the back row laughed once, then stopped because nobody else was laughing. Hannah did not laugh either. She looked at Caleb Doyle, and she looked at the dirt on his boots, and she looked at the wildflowers she had dropped, and then she bent down and picked them up. She held them in front of her with both hands. "All right," she said. "Marry us." That was the start of the marriage of Caleb Doyle and Hannah Reeve. The preacher got through the ceremony in about 4 minutes. He spoke fast and a little off the page. Caleb said, "I do," without taking his eyes off Hannah. Hannah said, "I do," without taking her eyes off the wildflowers. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and asked Caleb if he wanted to kiss the bride. Caleb said, "Already did, Reverend." "Mrs." Tully laughed for real that time. So did half the crowd. The other half were still trying to figure out what they had just watched. After the ceremony, Caleb did not stay for the cake Mrs. Tully had brought. He did not stay for the photographs the dry goods merchant had ridden over with his camera to take. He shook the preacher's hand, said thank you, and then he walked over to Hannah and stood in front of her with his hat in both hands. "Ma'am," he said, "it's a long ride to the cabin. We ought to start before noon." She nodded. He helped her up onto the wagon. Her trunk was already in the back. He had brought a second horse tied behind, because he had ridden down on his and had no way to bring a wagon up the mountain, and the wagon would have to be left at a homestead halfway up. Hannah did not understand any of this until he explained it on the road, and even then he explained it the way a man explains things to himself out loud. They rode for 6 hours. He talked maybe 100 words the whole way. He pointed out a creek where there was good fishing. He pointed out a stand of trees where he had killed an elk 3 winters back. He pointed out the place where the road turned into a trail. She listened. She did not ask questions. She had 31 days of riding in her bones, and the truth was she did not have any questions yet. She was watching him. She was learning him the way you learn a language, by listening to it spoken even when you don't understand what's being said. Once, late in the afternoon, he stopped the wagon at a creek and let the horses drink. He climbed down and walked around to her side and held up his hand to help her. She took it. His hand was the size of 2 of hers and felt like it was made of something harder than skin. She let him help her to the ground and walked a few steps to stretch her legs. When she came back, there was a tin cup of fresh water sitting on the wagon seat where she had been. He had filled it for her without saying a word about it. She drank the whole thing. The cabin was at the top of a long pine draw, smaller than she had pictured, squarer. The roof was sound, the way he had promised. There was a stone chimney and a porch with one chair on it. There was a barn behind the cabin, a small corral, and a garden patch with onions and beans, and what looked like a row of carrots just coming up. The whole place was surrounded by mountains, and the mountains were the kind that did not pretend to be friendly. He helped her down off the wagon. He carried her trunk inside. The cabin had one room, a bed in the corner with a quilt on it, a table with two chairs, a stove, a few shelves with books on them, more books than Hannah had expected, a rifle on pegs above the door, a pair of snowshoes leaning in the corner. The floor was wood swept clean. He set her trunk down at the foot of the bed. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I made the bed up fresh this morning," he said. "Clean sheets. I'll sleep in the barn." She did not answer right away. "There's coffee in the tin," he said. "Stove still warm. There's biscuits in the cloth. I shot a rabbit yesterday. It's hanging in the spring house. I figured we could have it tonight." She nodded slowly. He stood there a moment longer, like he was waiting for her to say something. When she didn't, he tipped his head once, said "ma'am," and walked out the door. She heard him crossing the yard. She heard the barn door open. She heard it close. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, slow and steady, and somewhere far off a hawk made one long sharp cry. Hannah Reeve, who was now Hannah Doyle, sat on the bed in her dove-gray dress and looked at her hands. The wildflowers were still in her lap. She had not put them down since the churchyard. She put them down now. She got up. She walked the perimeter of the cabin. She ran her hand along the spines of the books on the shelf. They were not the books she would have expected. A Bible, a book of Shakespeare, 2 volumes on the natural history of the West, a single book of poems by a man whose name she did not recognize. The pages of all of them were soft with use. She thought about a man alone for 10 years with 5 books, and how many times he must have read each one. She found the coffee tin. She poured herself a cup. She sat in the chair by the table, and she drank it slowly, and she watched the light move across the floor. For the first time in over a year, she felt like she was somewhere instead of going somewhere. She did not hear the horses coming up the draw. She heard them when they were halfway up. The sound came in late, but it came in sharp. 3 horses coming hard. She set her cup down on the table. She walked to the window. The riders crested the rise just as Caleb came around the side of the barn with an axe in one hand and a stack of cut wood in the other. He stopped when he saw them. He set the wood down on the porch. He kept the axe. The lead horse stopped at the edge of the yard. The man on it swung down before the dust had settled. Hannah went very still. It was Edmund. Edmund Reeve in his good Eastern coat, with 2 days of trail dust on his collar and a mouth pressed thin the way she remembered. He had 2 men with him. Big men. The kind of men her brother-in-law hired when he wanted something done that required hands. She had not seen Edmund Reeve in 9 months. She had not expected to ever see him again. She had crossed 2/3 of a continent to put distance between herself and that face, and now that face was standing in her yard in his good Eastern coat, and the distance had not been enough. Caleb did not speak. He stood in front of the porch with the axe at his side and looked at the 3 men the way a man looks at 3 where the fronts coming together over a valley he knows well. Edmund saw Hannah through the window. His face changed. "Hannah," he called. "Come out here." She did not move. "Hannah, don't make me come in there." Caleb took 1 step forward. He did not raise the axe. He did not raise his voice. He just took one step, and the two big men with Edmund both shifted in their saddles, and the horse closest to Caleb sidestepped a foot to the right. "Lady's name," Caleb said, "is Doyle now." It was the longest sentence anyone in that yard had ever heard him say. Edmund laughed once. It was not a real laugh. "That's so," he said. "Well, Mr. Doyle, we've come a long way. I'd like a word with my sister-in-law, if you don't mind." "She can come out if she wants to," Caleb said. "She doesn't, you ride." Edmund looked at the cabin. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the two men he'd brought. Then Hannah opened the door. She came out onto the porch in her dove-gray dress and stood beside Caleb. She did not touch him, but she stood close enough that the hem of her dress brushed the side of his trouser leg, and she made sure Edmund could see that. "Edmund," she said, "what are you doing here?" "I came to bring you home," he said. "Margaret has been beside herself. She hasn't slept since you left. The whole family thinks you've lost your mind, Hannah. Running off out here and marrying a stranger. A man you'd never met. We had no idea where you were until your letter came 2 weeks late. I'm not coming home, Edmund. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Edmund took a step toward her. Caleb did not move, but something in the air changed, and Edmund did not take a second step. "Hannah," Edmund said lower now. "There's something we need to discuss. In private. Family business. It's about James. Her dead husband. Edmund's brother." She felt Caleb's eyes on the side of her face. She did not turn to look at him. "Anything you want to say about James," she said, "you can say in front of my husband." It was the first time she had used the word husband, and it came out steadier than she expected. If you're still with me on this one, take a second now and hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more coming, and I don't want you to miss any of it. Edmund looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside of his coat. Caleb's hand tightened on the axe handle. The two big men shifted again. But what Edmund pulled out wasn't a gun. It was a folded paper. "James left a parcel of land outside Hartford," Edmund said. 68 acres. He left it to you in his will, Hannah. Margaret and I didn't know until the lawyer found a second copy of the document last month. We came to tell you, and to ask you to sign it back to the family, because you can't farm 68 acres in Connecticut from a cabin in the territories. We're prepared to offer you a fair price for it." He held the paper out. He smiled the smile she remembered from when he'd told her the house wasn't really hers. Hannah did not take the paper. "How much?" she said. $200. The land is worth 8 times that. Hannah, it's worth 8 times that, Edmund, and you know it, because you and Margaret have been trying to buy it from the rest of the family since before James died. That's why he left it to me. He wanted you not to have it." Edmund's face went very still. "You're going to ride home now," Hannah said. "You're going to leave the paper, and you're going to ride home, and when I'm ready to sell that land, I'll write to a lawyer who is not your lawyer, and you'll find out about the sale in a letter." Edmund did not ride home. He took one more step toward Hannah, and this time the step was meant to mean something. The two big men dismounted. They came around their horses. They had the look of men who'd been paid to do the thing that was now starting. Caleb moved before any of them got close enough to touch her. He did not swing the axe. He didn't need to. He set it down on the porch behind him in one motion, and then he stepped down off the porch and put himself between Hannah and Edmund, and the way he stood made the two big men slow down. "Mr. Caleb said, I'm asking once." The bigger of the two big men kept coming. What happened next happened fast. Caleb caught the man's arm at the wrist and the elbow, both at once. He turned his hip. The man went over Caleb's shoulder and came down on his back in the dirt, with a sound that came out of his chest like all the air in him. The second man hesitated. He did not hesitate long. He came in low. Caleb stepped inside of him, took him by the collar and the belt, and put him face down across the porch rail. The rail held. The man did not get up right away. Edmund had not moved. Caleb walked up to him. He did not put his hands on Edmund. He just stood close, closer than was comfortable, and looked at him. "You ride out," Caleb said. "You don't come back." Edmund's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You hear me?" Edmund nodded once. Caleb stepped back. Edmund got on his horse without a word. The two big men got up slow and crawled into their saddles. They rode out the same way they had come in, except slower, and the lead horse did not look back. Hannah stood on the porch and watched them go. She watched them until they were past the rise. She watched the dust settle. She watched Caleb pick up the axe and the wood and carry both into the barn. She watched him come back across the yard. She watched him stop at the foot of the porch steps and take his hat off and hold it in both hands and look up at her, the way he had looked at her in the churchyard. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry about that." She came down the porch steps. She walked right up to him. She looked at his face, at the beard and the lines around his eyes that the years alone had cut, and the dust on his coat, and the small cut on his knuckle where the bigger man's belt buckle had caught him. She put her hand on his cut knuckle. "What did you mean," she said, "in the churchyard?" He looked at her confused. "What you said. You had to know if I was real." He thought about it. He took his time. He was a man who said things plainly, but only after he'd looked at them all the way around first. "It's not just that I hadn't seen one," he said. "I'd been up there 10 years. I'd been up there long enough that some days I'd start to think I'd dreamed everything that was ever good. People, voices, the way a woman talks. I'd start to think maybe none of it had ever been real, and I just made it all up to keep myself company. And then I read your letter. The one the trapper read me. And I thought, what if she's not real either? What if I get down there and there's nobody? What if I made her up too?" He stopped. He looked at his hat. "Then you stepped off that wagon," he said. "And I just had to know. So I touched you. That's all I meant." Hannah did not say anything for a long time. Then she stood up on her toes and she kissed him. She kissed him the way he had kissed her. Without permission, without ceremony, without warning. Her hands on either side of his face. The way you kiss someone when you have decided. When she stepped back, his eyes were closed. He kept them closed for a second longer than he needed to. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You don't have to sleep in the barn." He opened his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "I think I'd better. For tonight. We've got time." She looked at him for a long second. Then she smiled. It was the first time she had smiled all day. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow night you don't sleep in the barn." "No, ma'am. And stop calling me ma'am. I'll work on it." She turned and walked back up the porch and into the cabin. At the door she stopped. She turned around. She looked at him standing in the yard with his hat still in his hands. "Caleb." "Yes. Thank you." He nodded. He could not seem to find a word to say back. So he said nothing, which was the thing he was best at, and she understood it the way she had been learning to understand his silences all day. She went inside. He stood in the yard and watched her go. He stood there for a long time after the door had closed. Then he picked up the wood he had cut, and he carried it inside, and he set it down by the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat in the chair across from her at the table. They ate the rabbit that night, the way he had said they would. They ate it with biscuits and the carrots from the garden. He talked more than he had talked all day. She asked him questions, and he answered them, and when she asked him a question he didn't know the answer to, he said so plain. She slept in the bed. He slept in the barn. That was their first night. The marriage lasted. That's the part of the story most people don't bother to tell. They tell you about the kiss in the churchyard, and they tell you about the line he said, and a few of them tell you about Edmund Reeve riding off with the dust on his back. But almost nobody tells you about the part that came after, which was the part that made it a marriage. The first winter was hard. The cabin was built for one. He spent most of November adding a back room with a second window, because he said she ought to have a place to sit that wasn't where he sat. She said that was kind of him, and she did not tell him that she liked sitting where he sat. He figured it out by spring on his own. She taught him to write. He had not held a pen in 12 years by then. He learned slow. His letters were the size of horseshoes for the first 3 months. She did not laugh at them. He did sometimes when she wasn't looking. He taught her to read sign on the trail. He taught her which mushrooms were food, and which ones were a bad afternoon, and which ones were a funeral. He taught her to shoot a rifle, because the territory was the territory, and a woman alone in a cabin in winter ought to know how. She turned out to be a better shot than he was at 50 yards. He acted surprised the first time. He stopped acting surprised the third time. In the spring of their second year, she had a son. She named him James, after her first husband, and Caleb did not say a word about that, because he understood that there were rooms in her life he had not been in and never would be in, and that James was a name she needed to put somewhere she could see it. She had a daughter 2 years after that. She named her Anne, after Caleb's mother, who Caleb had not spoken about until the night before Anne was born. He told her about his mother that night, sitting at the table by the stove, in one long quiet hour. It was the most he had ever said about the years before the mountain. He did not say much about the years on the mountain. Some things Hannah came to understand did not need to be said. Some things a man worked out by himself in 10 winters of weather and silence, and when he came down off the mountain, what he brought with him was not the story of those years, but the man those years had made. She had married the man. She did not need the story. Edmund Reeve never came back. The letter from the lawyer in Hartford arrived 8 months after the day in the yard. Hannah sold the 68 acres for $1,400. She put the money in a bank in Denver and never spent any of it for herself. When James turned 18, he used part of it to buy a press and start a small newspaper in the valley. When Anne turned 20, she used part of it to go to a teaching school in St. Louis. The rest of it sat in the bank and did what money does when nobody is in a hurry. Caleb died in the winter of his 63rd year. He died easy in his bed, with Hannah's hand on his hand. He had lived almost 30 years off that mountain, and he had said more words in those 30 years than in the 40 before them, but he had never become a man who said pretty things. He said true things. That was the only kind of thing he knew how to say. The day before he died, he asked her to sit on the bed beside him. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the churchyard, and the way he had looked at her in the yard the day Edmund came, and the way he had looked at her every morning of every year of their marriage. "Hannah," he said, "I want you to know something." "All right. I haven't seen another woman in 31 years. She laughed. She laughed the way she had not laughed since she was a girl, with her whole chest, and she put her forehead against his forehead, and she said, "Caleb Doyle, you old fool. I had to know if you were still real," he said. "I have to know it every day." She held his hand. "I'm real," she said. "I'm right here." He nodded. He closed his eyes. That night he slept. The next morning he didn't wake up. She buried him in the meadow above the cabin, the one with the long view of the valley. She put a stone on the grave with his name on it and the years he'd lived. Underneath the years, she carved one line, and she carved it herself, with a chisel she had bought in town for that purpose. The line was the sentence he had said in the churchyard, the day they were married, before the preacher had even opened his book. She wrote it the way he would have said it. Plain, honest, without apology. She sat by the grave for a long while after she was done. The wind moved through the pines, slow and steady, and somewhere far off a hawk made one long sharp cry. Then she went home,